through networking. If you look at solutions to business regulation, to customs, to environment, health and safety, a huge number of other fields, real progress tends to be made by getting together groups of officials and players and participants, often with somewhat similar values, and they generate solutions, often more powerful solutions than you get from some kind of very weak formal international agreement. So if you start thinking about the role of networked governance at the international level, this is another way of tackling international problems.
This is where in the High Court I'd say, what is the question?
Now, the question is, well, I did have a bit more to say. Your Honour, with respect, Your Honour, the next step is to do some analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of these networked arrangements. And typically the weaknesses, for example, are lack of accountability, disproportionate representation of major interests at the expense of minor ones, and a range of issues like that. Now, the question that I'm leading up to, and I'm expecting a yes or a no on this, is does it strike you that there might be some value in someone having a look at the work that's been done on international networked governance as a way of tackling problems, as a further way of thinking about the challenges facing the Commonwealth?
Well, the Commonwealth is nothing if not a network. I mean, the 100 organisations that exist that are called the Commonwealth Surveyors Association, the Commonwealth Lawyers Association, the Commonwealth Magistrates and Judges Association, the Commonwealth Surgeons Association. There are hundreds of them. Oh, well, there's at least 100 of them with that title, and there are hundreds of others that circumnavigate the world of the Commonwealth. Many of them meet in Marlborough House, and they put out rather amorphous statements of bland generality, and that's fine, and that is useful, and the networking that happens is actually quite useful, and it's supportive of a larger Commonwealth enterprise. But the bottom line is the politics of it, and the 53, now 54, having added Rwanda, which was not ever ruled by the British, but which was added in Port of Spain, these countries meet twice a year with their heads of government, and they put out these statements about rule of law, independent judges, fundamental human rights, and so on. They talk the talk, but they don't always walk the walk. And so the question is not how we can have more networking at the level of citizens, because that's actually quite strong. And as the Executive Director of the Royal Commonwealth Society, who, by the way, is a Sri Lankan Australian who was a Rhodes Scholar, went to England and has the chutzpah of an Australian, but the sort of outlook of somebody with a different cultural background as well. He says those bodies would probably survive, even if the CHOGM and the politicians went away, like the British fleet. Still the associations founded substantially in the language would continue to operate, and the internet facilitates and encourages that. So that would continue. But the question really is, how can we ensure that this body, which has occasionally, as in South Africa, Rhodesia, as in Fiji, as in Zimbabwe, been a useful player in the good values that are asserted? And given that we share the common language and many things in common, electoral ideals and legal ideals and human rights ideals, how can we make that work more effectively? And how can we do so in a body where, until recently, the president of Maldives was a man named Gayoom, who ruled imperiously for 30 years. And he was the most attentive, the most faithful attender at Commonwealth meetings. He was always there. He loved to be in the presence of the Queen. And yet back home he locked everybody up, including the man who is now the President, who wouldn't allow, in his turn, the Leader of the Opposition to have access to Parliament. So the question is, how do we react? How do we have a body within the Commonwealth that reacts more effectively to that sort of problem? Or is it too difficult? Or is it impossible? Or won't they come if they realise that it's going to be at a price, that they've got to walk the walk, that they've got to be serious about these obligations that they repeatedly assert that they accept? So this is really the challenge, and it's not an easy issue, and the trick is going to be, it seems to me, to find enough of the commonalities that make the Commonwealth a useful body for the smaller states, but which insist, as the larger and older Commonwealth members really want, that it shouldn't be a hypocritical body that's asserting one thing and then going straight home and doing another. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Just a question about economics from my economics background. Whether or not the link between the economic benefits that can be generated by the Commonwealth may well flow through to the human rights and other values that the Commonwealth has a pseudo forum for trade negotiations.
Well, that is certainly what some of the smaller and developing countries want, and they assert that we will never get really effective protection of human rights when people don't have access to water and when they are living in conditions of extreme poverty. Back in the 1990s, I served as a special representative of the Secretary-General, Boutros Ghali, in Cambodia, and it taught me a lesson which Australians need to learn, and Australian lawyers particularly, that when you go to many countries in Asia and talk about human rights, what they're talking about and thinking about is access to drinkable water, access to education for their daughters, access to emergency health care if they step on a landmine. These are real human rights. And Eleanor Roosevelt, in that brilliant committee back in 1947, made sure that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, those rights, the economic, social and cultural rights, are there and of equal value with the civil and political rights. Westerners tend to think only of civil and political rights, and they're very important, but there are also the other rights, and so somehow we've got to acknowledge that in the West. But there's a degree, I think it would be fair to say, I detect in some of the submissions and messages, there's a degree of impatience with the idea that the Commonwealth should start barging into the economic fora, into the G20 or into activities on the outskirts of the OECD, that is something they can do in their individual capacity, but doing that through the Commonwealth is going to change its nature. But I must admit that I think there's a lot of truth in the fact that you need to do both things. You need to do what the West wants, the Western members want, which is more truth in truly respecting freedom of expression and not locking up journalists or others simply because they express a minority view, but respecting the view of the developing countries of the Commonwealth and somehow ensuring that they get a voice in the global economic discussions, because the GFC really taught them that that was really important for their economics and their capacity, if they have the will, to deliver human rights to their populace. One last question? Yes.
I can speak without a microphone, I guess.
Oh, I think they'd like to hear every word of it.
It just struck me listening to your comments that there's almost an alignment with what we try to do with remote and Indigenous communities in Australia. And the big problem as, you know, a government employee going into one of those communities is that we expect to get respect, which is not what the people that we're trying to help are expecting. They're just expecting to be helped. And the smaller communities in the Commonwealth are those that really need that assistance, and the more Western communities in the Commonwealth are wanting people to play their game. And it just seems so colonial that it's almost, you know, back to its roots in that approach. And perhaps a way forward might be to think about just supporting those smaller communities, accepting their flaws, and trying to find ways of assisting them. And then that brings about a security benefit to the West, because small failed communities are always dangerous, without worrying too much about trying to achieve these fantastic universal rights that we would all like everybody to benefit from if they can't get those basic rights, which are obviously food, water and security. So is there a different way of approaching it, which is secure those nations' future so that they have a greater role in the world in the future, and let the Commonwealth evolve in that sense?
There's a partial flaw in your question, though you have some very good points in your question. The partial flaw is the notion that civil and political rights are a kind of colonial imposition upon others. That's another thing I learned in Cambodia. I asked them, during the terrible regime of the Khmer Rouge, did you know that what was being done to you was wrong and against your dignity and rights as a human being? They looked at me in astonishment. Of course we knew, of course, but there was nothing we could do about it. Don't let us have a truly imperial or colonial view that we don't think that the people of Belize and of Malawi and of other countries don't know they have a fundamental human dignity and a right to universal human rights. Those universal human rights belong to everybody, and that has been repeatedly reaffirmed. Now, the last decision I made as a Justice of the High Court of Australia was the decision of Wurrajul. Wurrajul was the very last case I handed down, and it was the very last judicial act in 34 years of judicial service. It was the challenge to the Northern Territory intervention, and it depended on a decision about a technical question of a demurrer in a legal process, which is raising a legal objection that seeks to knock out a case without a hearing at all. I, for various reasons which I explained, was in favour of rejecting the demurrer. The majority of the court upheld the objection and knocked it out. Now that was a result of the Northern Territory intervention, which, as we all know, was done 8 weeks in from a federal election. It was done without any consultation whatsoever with the Aboriginal people. It was truly, on the face of things, a kind of colonial imposition. It may have been done by those who did it for the purpose of assisting the Aboriginal communities, but it was imposed without any consultation, which was a point that was repeatedly emphasised in the report of the Northern Territory Committee, that everything had to be done with full consultation. The result of which was, exceptionally, we put into the Northern Territory soldiers as well as police. We put people at a disadvantage on the basis of their race. We removed the